This story has a hopeful ending. A mother afraid of losing control during delivery finds strength she didn't know she had. Real story, told by a gynecologist. Not medical advice. You are safe here. Let's begin. You know, I still remember the morning Fernanda walked into my clinic. It was autumn, and the leaves outside were just starting to turn. She sat down in the chair across from me, and I noticed she was gripping her handbag so tightly her knuckles had gone white. I asked her the usual questions. Last menstrual period? Any previous pregnancies? Family medical history? She answered everything perfectly, like she had rehearsed it. But when I asked her how she was feeling, truly feeling, something in her face shifted. She looked at me and said, "I don't know if I can do this." Now, I've heard those words hundreds of times from expectant mothers. But with Fernanda, there was something different in her voice. It wasn't just nervousness. It wasn't typical first-time mother anxiety. This was deeper, heavier, like she was carrying something she'd been holding onto for decades. She was 34 years old, healthy, active. She and her husband had been trying for 2 years before she finally saw those 2 pink lines. Everyone around her was celebrating. But Fernanda couldn't celebrate. Because the moment she found out she was pregnant, she also found herself remembering stories her grandmother used to whisper. Stories about Fernanda's own mother. I didn't push her. I just waited. Sometimes the best thing a doctor can do is be quiet and let the patient find her own words. And after a long pause, Fernanda finally let go of that handbag and placed her hands on her lap. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke again. She said her mother almost died giving birth to her, that the delivery went wrong in ways no one fully explained, that her mother never really recovered. Not just physically but inside. And ever since Fernanda was a little girl, she had carried this quiet, secret terror that her body would betray her too. I sat there listening, and I felt my heart ache for her. Because Fernanda wasn't afraid of pregnancy. She was afraid of a story that wasn't even hers. But here's the thing about fear. It doesn't care whose story it started with. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes, and asked me a question I'll never forget. Will I lose control? When the time comes, will I lose control? And that's when I knew. This wasn't going to be a simple pregnancy. This was going to be a journey into the deepest parts of Fernanda's heart. Parts she had sealed off years ago. I took a breath and told her the only honest thing I could. Let's take this one day at a time. She nodded, but her eyes still held that question. And somewhere deep inside, I think we both knew the answer wouldn't come easily. After that first appointment, I sent Fernanda for routine blood work and a dating ultrasound. Standard stuff. But I could tell her mind was still stuck on what she'd shared with me. She kept rubbing her stomach absent-mindedly, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to feel connected to what was growing inside her. She came back a week later for her results. Everything looked normal. Healthy hormone levels. Strong early indicators. But when I told her this, she didn't smile. She just nodded and stared at the floor. That's when she started telling me more about her mother. Not the polite version she'd shared before. The real version. The one she'd never told another doctor. Her mother's delivery had been long. 36 hours, Fernanda said. This was back in the early 90s, in a small hospital that wasn't prepared for complications. Her mother had hemorrhaged after Fernanda was born. Not a little bleeding. The kind where nurses run and alarms beep and faces go pale. Fernanda's mother survived, but barely. She needed multiple transfusions. She spent a week in intensive care. And afterward, something in her changed. She became withdrawn, anxious, untouchable in a way that Fernanda felt but couldn't name as a child. I watched Fernanda's hands tremble as she spoke. She told me her mother never held her the way other mothers held their babies. Never rocked her to sleep without a distance in her eyes. Never spoke about the birth except to say, "I almost died bringing you into this world." Now imagine hearing that as a little girl. Hearing that your very existence nearly killed the person who was supposed to protect you. How do you grow up with that voice inside your head? How do you ever trust your own body after that? Fernanda didn't say those words out loud. but I could see them written all over her face. She told me she'd been in therapy before. Years of it. She thought she'd healed. She thought she'd moved past her mother's trauma. But then she got pregnant, and every old fear came rushing back like a flood she couldn't stop. Her husband tried to help. He told her modern medicine was different now, that hospitals had protocols for hemorrhaging, that she wasn't her mother. And logically, Fernanda knew all of this. But fear doesn't live in logic. It lives in the body, in the bones, in the stories we inherit without asking for them. She looked at me and said something I've thought about 1,000 times since. She said, "I'm not afraid of pain, doctor. I'm afraid of losing myself, of losing control and never finding my way back." I reached across the table and placed my hand on hers. She didn't pull away. "That's not going to happen," I told her. But even as I said it, I knew words alone wouldn't be enough. Fernanda needed more than reassurance. She needed proof. And proof, in pregnancy, takes time. Fernanda came in for her 12-week scan on a cold Tuesday morning. She'd been quiet during her previous visits, clinical almost, answering questions, following instructions, but never really present, never really allowing herself to believe this was happening. That morning was different. I could see it the moment she walked through the door. Her husband, Marcus, was with her. He held her coat while she signed in, and I noticed the way he kept his hand on the small of her back. Gentle, steady, like he was trying to ground her without saying a word. I brought them into the ultrasound room and asked Fernanda to lie back. She moved slowly, carefully, like she was afraid of disturbing something fragile inside her. Marcus sat beside her and held her hand. Now, I've performed thousands of ultrasounds. I've watched countless mothers hear their baby's heartbeat for the first time. And every single time, it's a miracle. But with Fernanda, I found myself holding my breath as I moved the transducer across her belly. There she was. The baby. Tiny but unmistakable. Curled up like a little bean with arms and legs just beginning to form. And then came the heartbeat. Fast. Strong. Perfect. A whoosh 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 that filled the room like music. Fernanda's face changed. I can't describe it any other way. It was like watching someone step out of a dark room into sunlight for the first time. Her lips parted. Her eyes widened. And then tears started streaming down her cheeks. Marcus kissed her forehead. Neither of them spoke. I pointed to the screen and showed them the flicker of the heart, the curve of the spine, the tiny hands that were already moving. The baby was measuring right on track. Everything looked healthy. Everything looked exactly as it should. But here's what I remember most. Fernanda reached up and touched the screen. Not the paper printout I would give her later. The actual screen. Like she needed to feel the image to believe it was real. And for a few minutes, I watched her fear crack open. Just a little. Just enough for something else to slip in. Hope maybe. Or wonder. Or the quiet beginning of love. She looked at me with wet eyes and smiled. A real smile. The first one I'd seen from her since we met. But then something happened. The smile faded. Her hand dropped from the screen. And she turned to me with an expression that broke my heart into pieces. She asked, "What if I lose control during delivery and something happens to both of us?" The room went quiet. Marcus squeezed her hand tighter. And I realized in that moment that hearing the heartbeat hadn't cured Fernanda's fear. It had simply made the stakes higher. Because now this wasn't just about her. Now there was a real baby girl with a real heartbeat. And Fernanda was terrified she would fail her. By week 24, Fernanda's pregnancy had been uneventful in all the right ways. Her blood work stayed normal. The baby was growing well. Anatomy scan showed a healthy girl with 10 fingers and 10 toes and a heart that refused to slow down. On paper, everything was perfect. But Fernanda's body had other plans. She came in for a routine checkup, and I immediately noticed something off. Her face looked fuller than usual. Her fingers seemed swollen. And when the nurse took her blood pressure, the numbers were high. Too high for someone who'd been perfectly healthy just 4 weeks earlier. I took it again myself. Same result. Gestational hypertension. It's common enough. Manageable in most cases. But for Fernanda, this diagnosis felt like confirmation of every dark thought she'd ever had. Her body was betraying her, just like her mother's body had, just like she'd always feared it would. She sat in my office with her hands pressed flat against her thighs. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. That's what worried me most. She had gone completely still, like an animal playing dead. I explained what this meant. We would monitor her closely. She'd need to check her blood pressure at home. She might need medication if things progressed. We would watch for signs of preeclampsia. I gave her clear instructions and tried to sound calm, confident, unafraid. But Fernanda wasn't listening. Not really. She was somewhere else entirely. Her husband started asking questions. Good questions. About numbers and medications and warning signs. Marcus was trying to be helpful, trying to take action. But Fernanda just sat there, frozen, while her worst nightmare wrote itself across her skin in swollen fingers and elevated numbers. Later that week, I got a call from her primary care doctor. Fernanda had come in complaining of headaches and trouble sleeping. She'd started checking her blood pressure every hour, sometimes more. She was documenting every sensation, every twitch, every moment of dizziness. She wasn't managing her condition. She was spiraling into it. I knew I had to do something different. Medical advice wasn't enough for Fernanda. She needed someone who understood that her body wasn't the only thing that needed treatment. Her mind did too. So I made a call to a colleague I trusted. A therapist who specialized in birth trauma and prenatal anxiety. Someone who wouldn't just tell Fernanda to relax or think positive thoughts. Someone who would sit with her in the darkness and help her find her way out. When I told Fernanda about this, she looked relieved, and then ashamed. She asked me if referring her to a therapist meant I thought she was crazy. I told her the truth. I said, "Fernanda, you're not crazy. You're carrying a weight that was never yours to carry. And you don't have to carry it alone anymore." She finally cried. Not the quiet tears I'd seen before. Real, heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and old. Marcus held her, and I sat with them both, waiting for the storm to pass. It did, but slowly, the way real storms always do. The therapy sessions started slowly. Fernanda told me later that she almost canceled her first appointment 3 times. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before walking in. But she went. And that was the first small victory. Her therapist, Dr. Elena, specialized in what's called birth trauma legacy, the way fear gets passed down from mothers to daughters without anyone ever speaking the words aloud. Fernanda learned that her mother's silence about the delivery had been louder than any story, that not knowing the details had made her imagination fill in the blanks with horrors. For 3 weeks, Fernanda practiced something new. Instead of fighting her fear, she started naming it. Instead of trying to push it away, she learned to sit beside it. She learned breathing techniques that activated her parasympathetic nervous system. She learned to visualize a container where she could place her worst-case scenarios, acknowledge them, then set them aside. I saw changes in her checkups. Small ones at first. She started making eye contact longer. She asked questions instead of just accepting answers. She even laughed once when I made a silly joke about how active her baby girl was during the Doppler check. But physically, her body wasn't cooperating. Her blood pressure remained stubbornly high despite medication. We increased the dose. Still high. I ordered additional monitoring, more frequent ultrasounds, non-stress tests twice a week. Fernanda came to every appointment. She never missed one. She was doing everything right. Then came the scan that changed everything. At 28 weeks, I noticed something on the ultrasound that made my stomach clench. Her placenta showed early signs of stress. Tiny calcifications that weren't supposed to be there yet. The blood flow wasn't as robust as I wanted to see. Her baby was still growing, but the curve had flattened slightly. I didn't tell Fernanda everything in that moment. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I needed time to consult with my colleagues. I needed a plan before I introduced more fear. But Fernanda knew. She always knew. She'd become hyper-aware of her body, and she'd learned to read my face better than any patient I'd ever had. "Something's wrong," she said. Not a question. A statement. I sat down across from her and told her the truth. Partial placental stress. Not an emergency yet, but something we needed to watch very, very carefully. She didn't cry. She didn't freeze. She took a breath, one of those slow, deliberate breaths she'd learned in therapy, and asked me what we were going to do about it. For the first time since I'd met her, Fernanda wasn't asking me to fix her fear. She was asking me to be her partner in protecting her baby. And I felt something shift in that room. Something I hadn't dared to hope for. Fernanda was learning to trust herself. Not because her fear had disappeared, but because she was finally willing to act in spite of it. It happened at 31 weeks. 3 in the morning. I was half asleep when my phone rang, and the moment I saw Fernanda's name on the screen, I was wide awake. Her voice was shaking. Not crying, but close. She told me she'd woken up to use the bathroom and noticed blood. Not a lot, she said. Not like a hemorrhage, but enough. Enough to trigger every fear she'd spent months trying to tame. I asked her the only question that mattered. "Are you having contractions?" A pause. Then, "I don't know. I don't think so. Maybe. My back hurts. But my back always hurts now." I told her to hang up and call an ambulance. She hesitated. I could hear Marcus in the background, already awake, already moving. She asked me if she should pack a bag. I told her to go. Now. The bag could wait. She hung up, and I lay there in the dark, staring at my ceiling. I'd handled hundreds of emergencies. Thousands, probably. But something about Fernanda's voice stayed with me. That quiet terror underneath the control. The way she'd said, "Not a lot," like she was trying to convince herself everything would be fine. I got dressed and drove to the hospital. The roads were empty. The sky was still black. And I found myself praying, something I don't do often, but that night I did. When I arrived, Fernanda was already in triage. Marcus stood by the door, pale and silent. Fernanda was on the bed, hooked up to monitors, and the moment she saw me, her eyes locked onto mine like I was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The nurses filled me in. Her bleeding had stopped briefly, then started again. The baby's heart rate was good, strong and steady, thank God. But Fernanda's blood pressure had spiked dangerously. And the ultrasound I ordered showed the truth we'd been dreading. Partial placental abruption. The placenta had begun separating from the uterine wall. Not completely, but enough. Enough that waiting was no longer an option. I sat down beside Fernanda and took her hand, the same way I had in my office weeks ago. But this time everything was different. I told her she needed an emergency C-section. Tonight. Right now. For a moment, I watched her face crumble. This was it. The moment she'd feared since childhood. The delivery room. The loss of control. The possibility that everything would go wrong. But then something remarkable happened. Fernanda looked at Marcus. Then she looked at me. And she asked, "Will my baby be okay?" Not "will I be okay?" Not "what if I lose control?" Her baby. That was all she cared about in that moment. I told her the truth. We're going to do everything we can for both of you. But we need to move fast. She nodded, squeezed my hand, and for the first time since I'd met her, Fernanda let go of her fear. Not because it was gone, but because something bigger had taken its place. She was still terrified, but she was also ready. The operating room was cold and bright. Fernanda later told me it felt like walking onto a stage she'd been dreading her entire life. But she walked. With Marcus beside her, wearing scrubs and a face full of terror, she walked into that room. I was already there, gown and gloves on, going over the plan with my team. We had 2 anesthesiologists, 3 nurses, a neonatologist from the NICU, and a respiratory therapist. Everyone knew Fernanda's history. Everyone knew this wasn't just a medical procedure. This was the moment she'd spent 9 months running from. The spinal block was placed. Fernanda's lower body went numb. She kept repeating something under her breath. Not a prayer, exactly, but close. Marcus held her hand and whispered to her, though I couldn't hear what he said. Then came the moment I'd been preparing for. The incision. The careful layers of muscle and tissue. Fernanda couldn't feel the cut, but she could feel pressure. She could feel tugging. And I watched her face change as her body responded to something it couldn't control. She started to panic. Quietly at first. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes darted around the room. She asked Marcus if she was bleeding. She asked me if everything was okay. I answered calmly, but I could see her slipping. And then I heard myself say something I hadn't planned. "Fernanda, look at me." She did. "You are not your mother. This is not her story. This is yours. And you are right here, right now, bringing your daughter into the world. You haven't lost control. You've given it to people who will take care of you. That's not weakness. That's the bravest thing a mother can do." I don't know where those words came from, but I watched something release in her face. Not all the fear. Not even most of it. But enough. Enough for her to take a breath and hold Marcus's hand and trust. The baby came out moments later. Tiny. Perfect. 31 weeks and fighting. Her cry was furious. Loud. Alive. And Fernanda heard it. Later, she told me that cry was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. Not because it meant her daughter was okay, though it did, but because it meant something had survived. Something had made it through the darkness. Something was here, in this cold, bright room, demanding to be seen. The NICU team took over. Wrapped her up. Checked her breathing. Her color was good. Her heart was strong. She weighed 3 pounds, 12 ounces, small, but mighty. I finished closing Fernanda's incision. The bleeding had been controlled. She was stable. Everything had worked. But when I looked at Fernanda's face, I realized something. She wasn't looking at the monitors or the blood or the machines. She was watching the NICU team hold her daughter. And for the first time in her entire pregnancy, her eyes weren't full of fear. They were full of wonder. They placed her daughter on Fernanda's chest for just one moment. One heartbeat. One impossible second of skin to skin before the NICU team had to take her away. The baby was so small, so fragile, with dark curls plastered to her head and her tiny fists already clenched like she was ready to fight. Fernanda couldn't hold her properly. Her arms were still weak from surgery, her body still numb from the spinal block. But she turned her head and pressed her lips to that tiny forehead. And she whispered something none of us could hear. Then the baby was gone. Whisked away to the NICU on a warm bed with monitors and wires and a team of specialists who would watch her breathing, her feeding, her every movement for days and weeks to come. Fernanda should have been exhausted. She should have been relieved. But as they wheeled her to recovery, her eyes stayed fixed on the door where her daughter had disappeared. And then the tears came. Not quiet tears. Not the controlled crying I'd seen from her before. These were loud, gasping sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient. Marcus climbed onto the recovery bed beside her and held her while she shook. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He just held on. Later, Fernanda told me something I'll never forget. She said that in that moment, she wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because for 31 weeks, she had been preparing herself to lose this baby. Preparing herself for disaster. Preparing herself to be her mother. But her daughter was alive. Crying. Fighting. Existing in a world that Fernanda had been so sure would take her away. And Fernanda realized something. She had spent her entire pregnancy afraid of losing control during delivery. Afraid that her body would fail. Afraid that she would fail. But when the moment came, she hadn't failed. Her body had done something extraordinary. Her body had grown a baby who was strong enough to cry, strong enough to survive, strong enough to demand her place in this world. None of that meant the fear was gone. Of course not. The NICU stay stretched ahead of them, like an unknown country. There would be good days and bad days. Days when the baby's oxygen levels dropped. Days when feeding felt impossible. Days when Fernanda would sit beside that plastic incubator and wonder if her daughter would ever come home. But something had shifted. Something permanent. The cry Fernanda heard in that delivery room wasn't just her daughter announcing her arrival. It was the sound of a story breaking. The The story Fernanda had been carrying since childhood. The story that said her body was a danger. That said control was the only safety. That said love always came with loss. That cry broke the silence Fernanda had been living inside for 34 years. And for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. The NICU became Fernanda's second home. She arrived every morning before sunrise and stayed until the nurses made her leave at night. Marcus came when he could, but someone had to work. Someone had to keep their world turning outside those hospital walls. So Fernanda sat alone for hours. Her hand slipped through the incubator port. Her finger wrapped around her daughter's tiny fist. Her daughter's name was Lucia. It means light. And Fernanda said the name chose itself the first time she saw Lucia's eyes, dark and wide and somehow knowing, like she'd been here before. The first week was hard. Lucia needed help breathing. A small tube delivered oxygen, and the constant beeping of monitors became the soundtrack of Fernanda's days. She learned to read those machines better than any nurse. She learned which numbers meant peace and which numbers meant trouble. She also learned to pump milk every 3 hours, even through the night. She learned to label bottles with Lucia's name and room number. She learned to sit beside other mothers in the NICU waiting room. Mothers who were fighting their own battles, carrying their own fears. One afternoon, Fernanda watched a mother say goodbye to her baby. Not the temporary goodbye of leaving for the night. The permanent kind. The baby had been born with organs that never fully formed, and after 6 weeks of fighting, his tiny body had given up. Fernanda sat in the hallway and wept for a child she'd never met. And then she went back to Lucia's bedside and held her finger a little tighter. That night she called me. It was late past 11 and her voice sounded different. Not afraid, but changed. She asked me if I thought she'd ever stop waiting for something terrible to happen. I told her the truth. Probably not. Some part of her might always carry that vigilance, that fear. But I also told her that vigilance wasn't weakness. It was love. It was the price of caring deeply in a world that offered no guarantees. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said, "I used to think control would save me. If I could just control everything, I'd be safe. But Lucia isn't safe. She never will be. None of us are. And somehow that's okay." By the end of the second week, Lucia came off oxygen. By the third week, she started taking a bottle. By the fourth week, she was gaining weight steadily, filling out those tiny cheeks, growing stronger every day. Fernanda still had bad moments. Moments when a monitor beeped wrong and her heart stopped. Moments when she looked at Lucia's fragile body and remembered the blood, the emergency, the terror of that night. But those moments passed. And when they did, Fernanda found herself still there. Still present. Still Lucia's mother. She wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. She was learning to live between fear and motherhood. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. 7 weeks. That's how long Lucia stayed in the NICU. 50 days of monitors and bottles and midnight feedings in a plastic chair. 50 days of learning to be a mother in a room full of strangers and beeping machines, and the quiet desperation of other families fighting the same battle. But then came the morning when the neonatologist smiled and said the words Fernanda had been dreaming about since Lucia's first cry. "She's ready. You can take her home tomorrow." Fernanda didn't scream or cry or clap her hands. She just sat there, staring at the doctor, waiting for someone to say, "Just kidding," or "We need to run one more test." But no one did. The doctor handed her discharge papers. The nurses started packing Lucia's things. And Marcus, who had taken the day off work just in case, fell to his knees beside the incubator and buried his face in his hands. That night, Fernanda didn't sleep. She sat in the nursery at home. The room she'd been too afraid to finish decorating, and she rocked an empty chair. She had painted the walls pale yellow months ago, then covered them with a sheet because looking at them hurt too much. Now she pulled the sheet down and stared at the color she'd chosen. Sunlight. That's what she'd called it. Sunlight yellow for a baby she wasn't sure would ever see this room. The next morning, She dressed Lucia in a going-home outfit that had been folded in a drawer for 7 weeks. White cotton with tiny yellow flowers. The outfit smelled like lavender, the same lavender Fernanda had tucked into Lucia's bassinet months ago, hoping, praying, daring to believe. Marcus carried the car seat to the NICU doors. Fernanda signed the last forms. A nurse hugged her. Another one cried. And then they walked out into a world that looked exactly the same as it had before Lucia was born, but somehow nothing like it at all. The car ride home took 23 minutes. Fernanda sat in the back seat next to Lucia, watching her daughter sleep, watching the rise and fall of that tiny chest. No monitors now. No guayers. Just a baby girl in a car seat, breathing on her own, alive in a world that had tried so hard to scare her mother away. Fernanda cried the entire drive. Not from fear. Not from relief. From something she never expected to feel. Peace. When they walked through the front door, the house was quiet. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows. Marcus set the car seat down and turned to Fernanda with a look of pure wonder, like he couldn't believe this was real. Fernanda lifted Lucia out of the car seat. She carried her daughter into the nursery, the yellow room, the sunlight room, and she sat down in the rocking chair. The same chair she'd sat in last night, empty and waiting. But this morning it wasn't empty. She held Lucia against her chest and felt her daughter's heartbeat against her own. 2 hearts. 2 survivors. 2 people who had made it through the darkness and found each other on the other side. And Fernanda whispered the words she'd been afraid to say for 34 years. You're safe. We both are. And I'm not going anywhere. Fernanda came back to see me 6 months later. I almost didn't recognize her at first. Not because she looked different, though she did, softer somehow, more at home in her own skin, but because of what she was carrying. Lucia. 8 months old now, with dark curls and round cheeks and eyes that missed nothing. She was awake and alert, looking around my office like she was taking notes for later. Fernanda set her on her lap, and Lucia immediately grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair and yanked. Fernanda laughed. A real full laugh. The kind I'd never heard from her before. We talked about her recovery, about the lingering effects of the gestational hypertension, which had resolved completely after delivery, about her scar, which had healed into a thin line she said she'd started touching sometimes, just to remind herself of what her body had survived. And then we talked about fear. She told me she still had bad nights. Nights when she'd wake up convinced Lucia wasn't breathing, would creep into the nursery and stand over the crib until she saw the rise and fall of those tiny ribs. Nights when her mother's face would appear in her dreams, saying those old words about almost dying. But something was different now. The fear didn't own her anymore. It visited like an unwelcome guest, but it always left. And in the spaces between fear, Fernanda had found something she never expected. She had found herself. Not the version of herself she'd been trying to become, the controlled, perfect, unafraid mother she'd imagined, but a real mother. A messy mother. A mother who got scared and kept going anyway. A mother who learned that her daughter didn't need her to be fearless. Her daughter just needed her to show up. Lucia started fussing, so Fernanda lifted her up and pressed a kiss to her forehead. The same spot she'd kissed in the delivery room 8 months ago. And I watched Lucia calm immediately, settling into her mother's arms like she belonged there. Because she did. She always had. Fernanda looked at me over her daughter's head and smiled. I used to think losing control was the worst thing that could happen to me, she said. But now I think the worst thing would have been never trying at all. Never letting myself love her because I was too afraid of what might go wrong. She stood up to leave, adjusting Lucia on her hip. The baby babbled something that sounded like "Mama," and Fernanda's face lit up like that yellow nursery wall. Like sunlight. I walked them to the door and watched them go. Fernanda didn't look back. She didn't need to. She was already walking toward something new. Something she'd built with her own 2 hands. Out of fear and hope and the fierce, stubborn love of a woman who refused to let her mother's story become her own.